Welcome to the Market Chronicles, where we break down the world of finance and markets. Make sure you subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss out on our future deep dives.
You got it.
So to kick off our very first episode, we're going to be diving into the mind of Michael Saylor.
The Bitcoin titan.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to be unpacking his thoughts on the future of Bitcoin.
Regulation.
And its potential to really reshape the global financial system.
Pretty big stuff.
Saylor's got some bold predictions about where Bitcoin's going, particularly the idea of a Bitcoin standard. Let's hear what he has to say.
There is no Bitcoin standard. So the time for you to worry is 50 years from now, when all the money in the world is Bitcoin, when Bitcoin is 450 trillion and it's worth, go figure, $50 million a coin. And then the currency of the country you live in is backed by Bitcoin, then you might see that, what'll happen? The more likely thing is that currency, the whatever yo-yo dollar, will be pegged to Bitcoin, and then someone will take over the government and said, hey, we're going off the Bitcoin standard. But they're not going to get rid of Bitcoin. Gold may be regulated, but it's also worth like $15 trillion, and Bitcoin is worth $1.3 trillion. So if we end up with the failure of gold, Bitcoin 10x's from here.
So Saylor's got a pretty long-term vision for Bitcoin, and he's painting this picture, years down the line where the market cap of Bitcoin is huge. Like, he's talking astronomical figures.
Right.
It makes you wonder, could a Bitcoin standard actually become a thing? Yeah.
And even if it does, how far away is that?
Right.
Like, is that something we'll see in our lifetime?
Right.
I think his main point is that Bitcoin's journey is just getting started. And this whole idea of a yo-yo dollar pegged to Bitcoin is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Imagine a country trying to run its economy with a currency that's tied to something as volatile as Bitcoin.
Right.
It just shows you how much would need to change.
Yeah.
In terms of how we think about money and the infrastructure that's needed for a global financial system based on Bitcoin.
So Saylor's not shying away from regulation at all. In fact, he sees it as a key part of Bitcoin's evolution.
Let's listen to what he has to say.
So in terms of being regulated, it is regulated, right? The IRS regulated in 2014 by saying it's property. You have to pay tax on it when you sell it. And it's regulated via these ETFs. So if you're an institution and by charter you have to own securities via a regulated custodian or via a regulated bank, you're buying FBTC or you're buying IBIT. Just like the SEC just approved options trading, but only on IBIT. So there are regulations. The regulations solved the issue of custody. They solved the issue of compliance. And that's why these spot Bitcoin ETFs are the most successful ETFs in the history of Wall Street, right? Billions of dollars is stampeding into those instruments. Oftentimes what's going on is the regulated instruments, like IBIT is one, but so is MSTR. They're basically regulated securities trading on high volume stock exchanges in the United States. There's a lot of liquidity, a lot of traditional capital that can trade those instruments. That's why they buy them, sell them, and trade them. And so no one's saying it's not going to be regulated. In fact, it's the opposite, which is as it's regulated, it's the green light for traditional money and institutional money to enter the asset class.
I think he's got a point about regulation not being something to be afraid of.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying it's actually what could make Bitcoin go mainstream. And this idea that regulation legitimizes Bitcoin is pretty interesting.
It is.
He uses the example of Bitcoin ETFs and how they've brought in so much institutional money.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't understand what ETFs really are. They're basically like baskets of assets.
Right.
And in this case, it's Bitcoin that's traded on stock exchanges. So it's a way for investors to get involved with Bitcoin without having to actually own it themselves, directly.
Yeah.
So I think Saylor sees all this capital flowing into these ETFs as a sign that Bitcoin's becoming more acceptable to these big institutional investors.
Okay, so it sounds like Saylor's saying that Bitcoin is becoming more legit because it's being accepted by regulators.
Exactly. And I think he's going to talk more about that next. So he walks us through Bitcoin's, path to becoming legitimate. And he points to these key moments like when the IRS recognized it as property back in 2014, and then, everything that came after that, like all the financial products tied to Bitcoin.
Right.
These are like, signals that Bitcoin's gaining acceptance from institutions and regulators. It's like it's moving from the fringes of finance into the mainstream.
He also talks about, how important it was when big players like Fidelity got into the Bitcoin space.
Right.
And all those public companies adding Bitcoin to their balance sheets.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, it shows growing confidence in Bitcoin.
For sure.
But it also kind of helps to normalize it as an investment.
Absolutely. It makes it seem less risky when these established players are getting involved.
Yeah, and it's interesting how Saylor acknowledges that early skepticism around Bitcoin. Like, would governments try to shut it down?
Yeah.
But his point about the IRS designating Bitcoin as property shows a shift.
Right.
It's like regulators were trying to figure out what Bitcoin was.
Right. How to categorize it instead of just, dismissing it outright.
Let's hear what Saylor have to say about how regulators have viewed Bitcoin over time.
Then when you actually saw the last administration, you saw positive speeches and characterization of Bitcoin as a digital asset. In fact, Gary Gensler, Jerome Powell, Christine Lagarde, and Janet Yellen all acknowledged it to be a legitimate digital asset. They said Satoshi created something innovative and real. And by the way, they classified it as a speculative asset, but not as a currency.
It's pretty huge when you have these big names in finance and government acknowledging Bitcoin.
Right.
It's like a turning point. It shows that they're starting to see it as a legitimate digital asset, not just some, speculative thing.
Yeah. And even though they're not saying it's a currency,
right,
this recognition gives Bitcoin more credibility.
Yeah.
It opens the door for it to become more integrated into our current financial systems.
Okay, so Saylor's making a distinction here between using Bitcoin as a currency and holding it as digital capital.
What does he have to say about that?
The real uncertainty around Bitcoin has been around its use as a digital currency, not as digital capital, right? If you're holding something and you want to do 10,000 transactions without any AML KYC at any size, now you're crossing over banking regulations and currency regulations, right? And that's highly controversial. But what's not controversial is whether institutions and individuals and corporations in the Western world can own property.
It's an important distinction.
Yeah.
He's saying that using Bitcoin for everyday transactions, that raises concerns about money laundering, regulatory compliance because it's pseudonymous.
Right.
But he's arguing that holding Bitcoin as an investment is less controversial.
Right.
Like it's digital property. It's like owning gold or real estate.
So it's more about Bitcoin as a store of value.
Exactly.
And he uses this analogy to really drive that point home.
Oh, yeah, let's hear it.
So it's been acknowledged, like Berkshire Hathaway can own billions of dollars of Apple stock, right? Warren Buffett's not going to wire $1 billion of Apple stock to Africa without acknowledging that transaction publicly. So the use of Apple stock as currency would be controversial, but the use of Apple stock as property or capital, not so controversial. When you think of Bitcoin as, I own a building, right? Am I allowed to own a building? Well, the truth is you can own a building in China as well as in the United States or Europe. You know where you can't own a building? Cuba or North Korea. So where it's illegal to own property, then Bitcoin is in a regulatory gray zone for sure. But where it's legal to own property, you're going to be able to own it. And I think we've crossed that chasm between 2020 and 2024.
The analogy with the building is pretty clever. He's basically saying that if you can own property in a place, then you should be able to own Bitcoin. Like a basic property, right? It's a smart way to frame it because it gets away from all the complicated stuff about monetary policy and just focuses on the right to own assets.
So is he saying that Bitcoin is supported by regulators?
I think that's what he's getting at.
That's his reasoning?
It's quite obvious, right? If BlackRock is handling the asset, if there's 100 public companies handling the asset, if the SEC is approving options trading on the asset, and if the CME trades commodity options approved by the CFTC, it's pretty obvious that the asset has been adopted and is supported by the regulators. So I think we're past that question.
I mean, he makes a strong case.
Yeah.
He points to BlackRock.
Well,
all these public companies investing,
right.
the SEC and the CFTC approving Bitcoin-related products.
Yeah.
It's hard to argue that Bitcoin's still in some regulatory gray zone when you see all these major players operating openly within the Bitcoin market.
Okay, so now Saylor's talking about how most Bitcoin is held outside of ETFs.
Right.
And I think this is a really important point.
It is. Let's hear what he has to say.
If you go to Bitcoin treasuries, you'll see that 95% of the Bitcoin isn't in these ETFs. 20 for every dollar of Bitcoin in the ETF, $19 is not in the ETF. So Bitcoin is already a global asset outside the control of any nation state or any company or any actor. And that's what makes it so special. And if you think of it as property, it's no more risky for a New Yorker to buy $100 million of Bitcoin than it is for a New Yorker to buy $100 million worth of warehouse space in Manhattan.
Right. That's what makes Bitcoin so unique.
Yeah.
It's decentralized. Most of it isn't controlled by these traditional financial systems.
And that's what makes it so appealing to a lot of investors.
Exactly. They see it as a way to protect their wealth from, government interference or manipulation.
He goes back to that real estate analogy to make his point.
He really likes that analogy.
Yeah. Let's hear it.
Right? No one walks around New York saying, oh my God, the government's going to seize my warehouse space because they want to devalue the dollar. You're like, well, are you kidding? The government isn't backing the dollar on warehouse space in Manhattan. So it's just a piece of property that you're holding for long-term capital preservation.
He's saying that Bitcoin is like owning real estate. You're in control.
Right.
It's not subject to the whims of governments or central banks.
So to hedge against inflation.
Yeah. And also geopolitical uncertainty.
But even though Saylor's super bullish on Bitcoin,
yeah,
he does talk about some of the potential downsides too.
Right.
Let's listen.
And where you're going to get yourself in trouble is if you don't pay taxes on your warehouse space in New York City, or if you want to transfer $100 million worth of Apple stock to somebody in Africa and you don't want to talk about who you sent it to, right? Right. But those are problems that people that have $900 trillion worth of assets have today already. We're not going to change the politics or the geopolitics of the world here. What we're doing is giving people a better investment than Google. That's the point.
He's not saying that you can just, ignore taxes or anything like that.
Right.
Transparency is still important.
Yeah.
No matter what you're investing in.
So Bitcoin's not a free pass to do whatever you want.
No, but it's more about giving people options. More control over their money.
It's been really interesting to hear Saylor's perspective on Bitcoin.
Yeah, definitely.
He's clearly not just seeing it as some, speculative asset.
Yeah.
He thinks it can really change the world of finance. And I think he's laid out a pretty compelling case for how Bitcoin's evolved from this fringe thing on the internet to something that's being talked about on Wall Street.
So as Bitcoin keeps growing,
yeah,
what do you think are the biggest implications?
Well, I think one of the most important things is that it challenges the traditional financial system.
How so?
Well, it offers this decentralized model where transactions can happen directly between people.
So you're saying no more banks?
Potentially. It's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah, it is.
And that's why it's causing so much debate,
Right.
because it has the potential to really disrupt things.
Yeah.
Give people more control over their own money.
But do you really think Bitcoin could replace traditional currencies?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's come a long way,
Oh.
but it's still got some challenges like scalability and volatility.
Right.
And of course, all the regulatory uncertainty.
So it's not going to happen overnight.
Definitely not. But
Yeah.
even if it doesn't become the global currency, it's already had a huge impact on finance. It's driving innovation, and it's forcing these traditional institutions to adapt.
Like with central bank digital currencies.
Exactly, CBDCs. They're basically digital versions of fiat currencies
Yeah, okay.
issued by central banks.
Yeah.
And they're trying to capture some of the benefits of digital currencies.
Like faster transactions.
Yeah, and lower costs.
But still keeping the control and stability of traditional systems.
Right.
So it seems like Bitcoin's really pushing the boundaries.
It is. It's making us rethink how we think about money,
Yeah.
how we manage it, how we transact. It's a catalyst for change.
And it's really interesting to think about all the possibilities.
For sure.
Like, what if we have a future where traditional and digital financial systems can coexist?
Maybe even complement each other.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea.
The next few years are going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
We'll see how this all plays out and what role Bitcoin will ultimately have.
Well, this has been a great deep dive into Michael Saylor's vision for the future of Bitcoin.
Definitely. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, from regulation to decentralization to how Bitcoin might challenge the traditional financial system.
We hope this has given everyone a better understanding of Bitcoin's journey so far.
And its potential impact on the world.
Keep learning, keep exploring, and as always,
keep those brains engaged.
And those portfolios diversified.
We'll see you in the next episode of the Market Chronicles.
Huge thank you to all our listeners for tuning in to the Market Chronicles. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more deep dives into the latest market trends, be sure to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. We'll be back soon with more insights, analysis, and expert perspectives to help you navigate this ever-changing landscape. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Market Chronicles.